All right. Thank you, Graham, for that extremely generous introduction. I'm quite new in this job. I started a few months ago as WildAid's South African representative. WildAid, as Graham said, focuses on the demand side of the, let's say, the wildlife crime, the wildlife trafficking system. But we've decided as an organization to start moving into the supply end of things, in other words, Africa, where a lot of these products come from, just by way of background. Anyhow, that's our logo. As Graham mentioned, WildAid has an enormous presence in China. You thought I was coming here to talk about wildlife. I'm sorry to disappoint you. I'm here to talk about drugs. You might wonder why. I've spent the last 5 years living in New York City, and in the last place that I lived, I could walk to the end of the block and pass 3 drug dealers. I knew them by name, they greeted my children, they were members of the community, and I could buy just about anything I wanted from them, should I desire to do so. Cocaine is, according to researchers, not any more expensive than it was decades ago before the so-called war on drugs started. The war on drugs, as you might know, is the US government's long-term program that to stop cocaine flowing into the US. This has been a heavily militarized program on which tens or hundreds of billions of dollars have been spent. It has been, in many ways, ineffective. And I want you to think about this. I want you to think about the fact that decades after the US started this extremely expensive militarized response to cocaine, that I could still walk down my block in Brooklyn, in not such a bad neighborhood, and pass 3 people that could sell me this commodity. And there's a parallel here with the illegal wildlife trade and with wildlife commodities. And there's a truism, a generalization we can draw from this, is that whenever there is persistent demand for a product in the marketplace, that demand will be satisfied, whether that product is legal or not. There are a few exceptions, but in general, that's the case. So the lessons, as I say, we should learn out of this, in my view, is we should really look quite carefully at what the drug researchers have done and what they've learned in researching the cocaine trade. And I just want to look here quickly at South Africa, just in case some people in the room don't know. But we have roughly 80% of the world's rhinos. We have 2 of the 5 or 6 species here. We have around 20,000 southern white rhinos. Nobody really knows the exact number. In 2008, a serious poaching epidemic began. Why? Because of demand for rhino horn in Asia, mostly in China and Vietnam, that rose up. And around about now, 2014 to 2015, given the rates of poaching, we are now moving into negative population growth of rhinos. In other words, poaching is now so bad that it is knocking back, it is outpacing the births of rhinos. I just want to give you another table here. Here are the figures for rhinos poached in South Africa, 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014. You can see this inexorable rise. You can also see a rise in arrests. And going back to that drug thing that I was talking about earlier, the enforcement has increased. The amount of money that's being spent on enforcement has increased. The number of arrests have increased. And, by the way, 43 alleged poachers were killed officially in Kruger Park last year. Some people say more. All of this enforcement hasn't done anything to turn the rate of poaching around. Now, again, the solution is that we should join up our efforts in anti-poaching with demand reduction on the other end. The great thing about wildlife commodities like rhino horn is that they're not addictive, like cocaine, and it's a lot easier to persuade people not to use them. And that's what WildAid has been doing for more than 10 years in China. I'll give you the example of sharks. During the 1990s, demand for sharks in China shot through the ceiling. Literally tens of millions of sharks per year were being used for shark fin soup. Their fins were being chopped off, the shark's carcass was discarded in the ocean, usually while the shark was alive. And this was changing ecosystems around the world, marine ecosystems, and putting a lot of sharks in danger of extinction. While they'd recruited some very well-known celebrities, including a man called Yao Ming, who is probably China's most famous sportsperson, a basketball player, and rolled out this media campaign. I'll show an example of which around the Beijing Olympics.
What if you could see how shark fin soup is made? If you could see how each year up to 70 million sharks are killed to end up in soup, could you still eat it? A third of all shark species are nearly extinct, but we can help save them.
Remember, when the buying stops, the killing can too.
When the buying stops, the killing can too. This is Wild Aid's slogan, and it is now extremely widely known in China, thanks to the fact that Chinese media companies have donated to us now hundreds of millions of US dollars worth of free airtime and free media space in China. Celebrities like Yao Ming have donated their time and their talent and their reputation to this cause. And we are now seeing changes in the demand for shark fin. In a matter of years, we now have 24 airlines, 3 shipping lines, and 5 major hotel groups that have banned shark fin on their premises and in their equipment. We've seen an 82% decline in sales just between 2012 and 2014 in some of the major cities we're monitoring. We've seen approximately a 50% price drop in that same time period, just over 2 years, in the Guangzhou market, which is one of the major markets for shark fin. And we are seeing around 80% price drops to the Indonesian fishers since the early 2000s. And a lot of fishermen are now dropping out of the shark fin business. In other words, this campaign and associated campaigns run by other organizations around shark fin are definitely having an effect. In other words, demand reduction really can work. I must emphasize that all this reduction in demand for shark fin has taken place in the context of no complete ban. It is still actually legal to buy and sell shark fin in China. It's just that we've managed to change people's mindsets in such a way that they no longer do so. Let's talk about black rhino. Black rhino, in 1970, there were 65,000 black rhinos in Africa, mostly in East Africa. I've seen old photographs with 200 black rhinos in a single frame. I don't think anybody can actually imagine that anymore, what we've lost. In 1993, there were only 2,300 black rhinos left. There was a 96% decline over the period of 1970 to 1993. That was this previous poaching wave, what I call, in a sense, poaching wave 1. We're now in poaching wave 2. And I think it helps us to look at what happened in that earlier poaching wave. A lot of the lessons seem to have been forgotten, certainly in the public eye, of what actually happened back in the 1970s, 1980s, and early 1990s, mostly in East Africa, not in South Africa, mostly in East Africa, where the world's largest rhino populations were at that point, and they were mostly black rhinos, which at that time were actually quite rare in South Africa. And I want to talk about the example of Taiwan. Taiwan at that time was one of the major centers of demand for rhino horn. It was a newly wealthy country. Its per capita wealth was far higher than mainland China's, for example, and along with countries like Japan, to some extent Korea, to some extent mainland China, and Yemen, where people were using rhino horn to make traditional dagger handles, Taiwan drove a huge upsurge in the demand for rhino horn, mainly for use in a sort of what I call a pseudo-Chinese traditional medicine, traditional Chinese medicine. It wasn't really a traditional medicine, but a sort of a pseudo-traditional Chinese medicine. I just want to show you this graph. It's very interesting. You see on the left-hand side, we're in 1980. In other words, the rhino population is in free fall due to this incredible wave of poaching. And the orange blocks represent the rest of Africa. The gray blocks represent South Africa, which at the time did not suffer an enormous amount of rhino poaching because we were further away from the ports from which this rhino horn was being exported to Asia. And you can see this East African rhino population just crashes But around 1993 and 1994, something important happens. This whole thing turns around. Well, what did happen? The Chinese State Council, the most senior decision-making body in China, banned the import, use, sale of rhino horn. Sent a very strong message to the population. In Taiwan, they came under pressure from the US trade sanctions. They also banned rhino horn in the same way and did a very strong enforcement action within the country. And within months, they shut down the rhino horn trade in Taiwan. But going along with all of this was a very serious demand reduction campaign. In other words, a public education campaign by conservation organizations telling people not to buy rhino horn. And this was extraordinary. I mean, literally within months, Taiwan, which, as I say, at the time was the major market for rhino horn, was shut down. From more than 80% of traditional Chinese medicine stores in Taipei stocking rhino horn to down to less than 1% in a matter of months. And Taiwan has remained that way. There is still very, very little demand for rhino horn in Taiwan because there was a cultural shift in that country that went from, as I say, from the education campaign to the ban, sent a very, very powerful message to the population that rhino horn was not something we should be buying. Now we're in a new wave of demand. It started in the mid-2000s. In Vietnam, there was a general called General Yap. He was a military commander. He was famous for beating the Americans and the French during the Vietnam conflicts. And he was famously long-lived and famously fit and healthy. And a rumor started circulating that General Yap's health and longevity was due to him using rhino horn. We have no evidence to know if this was true or not, but that was the rumor, and it went around, and it started the elite buying rhino horn. In China, we've seen a resurgence of demand through a bunch of quacks, really, who are pushing a sort of a pseudo-traditional Chinese medicine angle on rhino horn, telling people that it's a cure-all, that it's pure, it comes from Africa, not from polluted China, and things like this. And we've seen these, as I say, these cascades now of price increases with criminal networks in these two countries inventing new reasons for people to use rhino horn all the time among a very superstitious and rather uneducated, I have to say, elite in these countries. And rhino horn, as you might have heard, is now very, very, very expensive indeed. The latest use we've just heard is people using rhino horn beads to make into little necklaces that are kind of magical, cure-all kind of necklaces. These necklaces can sell for over 10,000 US dollars. And so we're seeing this ever-shifting demand landscape in this country, in these countries. Every few months, it seems sometimes, there's a new reason to buy rhino horn. This is a bad thing because it makes it very difficult for us to address demand, but it's also a very good thing because what it means is people's minds are constantly changing, and these consumers' minds are constantly changing, and we can inject our message into that change. And I think we can turn around rhino horn demand a lot faster than people think we can because of that. I just want to show you a new ad that we've done with Jackie Chan, the martial arts movie star. This is now rolling out in Asia.
If you're buying rhino horn, you may be paying for more than just horn. You're paying for guns, bullets, poison arrows, chainsaws, axes, and machetes to hack off the face of the rhino. And you are paying for the life of a beautiful creature. So please tell your friends and relatives, never buy products made from rhino horn. When the buying stops, the killing can too.
Anyhow, that's interesting stuff. Since we started this campaign, this is a new ad, but the campaign against rhino horn in China started roughly 2 years ago. We've seen a change in the awareness that rhino horn comes from poached wild rhinos. Remember, the criminal networks tell people rhino horns fall off the rhino every few years naturally, and people just pick them up in the felt, and the rhino doesn't get hurt. That's what people understand over there. We're trying to change that understanding, and as you can see, that understanding is already changing in China. The belief that rhino horn has a medicinal effect is similarly changing. It's a very strong message that the criminal networks are pushing people, and I must here add that the formal institutions of traditional Chinese medicine removed rhino horn from their pharmacopoeia in 1993. The formal institutions of traditional Chinese medicine do no longer recognize rhino horn as a medication. So let's bear this in mind. This trade is being driven by criminals and opportunists. Let's not be confused about that. A lot of people blame China and the institutions of China. The institutions of China in government and in traditional Chinese medicine have campaigned against rhino horn for a long time. This is an interesting result that came out of our new survey. Over 87% of people who admit to using rhino horn think the Chinese government should be more strict about controlling it. So even the users want the Chinese government to be more strict about controlling it. Anyhow, elephants is another thing that we're working on. We don't really know the exact numbers. It depends who you speak to, but somewhere between 20 and 40,000 elephants are being killed every year in Africa now. And this has been the truth for probably 4 years now. There is an elephant poaching nightmare that we're addressing through a campaign with a woman called Li Bingbing, who, aside from being one of China's most famous movie stars, is also a pop singer, extraordinary woman. And we've started this Ivory free campaign that is now running all over China, encouraging people not to buy ivory. And I'd like to show you an ad that we've just done with her. It's actually done by some students in a digital animation college there. This was designed to go out in 3D, by the way. So imagine you're sitting in a 3D movie theater with your glasses on when you watch this. This brings us back to where we are now. And what is Wild Aid planning to do here? Well, last year, we appointed a representative in Tanzania, and this year I've started work here in South Africa. And we are in the process of developing, for lack of a better term, African wildlife pride campaigns. We're trying to draw on the expertise of the organization in media and in this way we work, which is very different to the way a lot of organizations here work, to develop media campaigns. And these might be social media campaigns as well as traditional, let's say, above-the-line media campaigns, to try and shore up some of the institutions in Africa, because often we know what to do in terms of some of our conservation problems and our wildlife crime problems. I mean, conservation is an enormously complex endeavor. Let's not push that aside. But there are often things where we know what we need to do. We know where certain poaching kingpins live, for example. We know we need to arrest them. But the political will just isn't there. And it is a tough fact, especially here in South Africa, that wildlife conservation is an elitist white enterprise. And not very much has been done to change that. And that is one of the things that I would like to take on in my work here in a very big way, to try and shift the stories we tell ourselves around conservation, to try and shift the narrative, and to try and engage people in this country that haven't really thought about wildlife before or don't think that it's important, in a way that brings them into the story and creates the political environment that helps the South African government do what needs to be done. And seeing as I'm in this room with a whole bunch of travel people who do interesting things and interact with lots of people around the world, we would love you to be part of this. So it's Africa plus you, plus hopefully us, can help to make this change. Wild Aid is an extremely collaborative organization. We try not to be territorial. We try to be friends with everybody. And we love people who own billboard companies. We love people who have friends in broadcasting who can give us free space on TV. We love people who own safari lodges who can help us develop campaigns and provide accommodation for celebrities. We love people with great ideas who want to come and work with us to really do high-quality, hard-hitting work. So if any of you in this room have any idea how you'd like to be involved, how you'd like to help with either the work we're doing in Asia or these new African Wildlife Pride campaigns that we're developing now for Africa, please come and see me afterwards. I'd love to hear from you. And once again, thank you for Conservation Lab for providing me with this wonderful opportunity. Thank you very much.